The night was eerily quiet, with only the soft rustling of leaves carried by the cool breeze. In the distance, the faint sound of a howl broke through the silence. A Mustang horse stood alone in a small clearing, its chestnut coat glowing faintly under the silver moonlight. The young horse shifted uneasily, ears flicking in every direction. It wasn't just the darkness that unsettled it. There was something out there, hidden in the shadows. The bushes around the clearing began to quiver. The Mustang froze, its dark eyes wide with fear. Then came a low growl followed by another. One by one, pairs of glowing eyes emerged from the darkness. Wolves, hungry and unrelenting. The Mustang backed away, its hooves scraping against the hard ground. But the circle of predators grew tighter. A sharp bark pierced the air, sending the horse into a desperate, trembling state. The pack crept closer, their teeth gleaming in the moonlight. The air seemed to hold its breath as the wolves closed in, their growls echoing in the still night. The Mustang reared back, its cry filled with fear and defiance, but the pack wasn't going to back off. This was their hunt, and the young horse was their target. Just when it seemed the night would end in tragedy, a sharp whistle rang out from the shadows. The wolves stopped, their heads snapping toward the sound. A figure emerged from the trees, moving swiftly and purposefully. The person carried something, a long stick that gleamed faintly under the moonlight. "Back off," the voice commanded, firm but calm. The wolves hesitated, their growls fading into uneasy whimpers. The Mustang turned its head, its breath shallow as the figure stepped into the clearing. The pack retreated, but their eyes lingered on the lone horse, and the one who dared to stand between them and their prey. What happened next would change everything for both the Mustang and the unexpected hero who came to its rescue. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the rolling hills. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of dew-soaked grass and pine. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of nearby trees, their shadows swaying gently on the ground. The peaceful stillness of the morning was interrupted only by the occasional chirp of a bird or the distant rustle of wildlife starting its day. Near the edge of the forest, Jake Marshall trudged through the uneven terrain. His boots crunched softly against the dirt trail, scuffing occasionally on loose rocks. Jake was no stranger to these parts. At 35, he'd spent most of his life wandering these hills, repairing fences, checking water troughs, and making sure the land was in order. It was quiet work, but he liked it that way. This morning, though, something felt different. Jake paused for a moment and glanced around. The sunlight streamed through the trees in golden shafts, but there was a weight in the air he couldn't quite explain. He adjusted the worn strap of his pack over his shoulder and muttered, "Feels off today." He pressed on, his sharp eyes scanning the landscape for anything unusual. The grass was damp underfoot, and the faint glint of dew sparkled like tiny stars. The path he followed wound its way toward a narrow clearing near the woods. It was a familiar route, one he'd walked countless times. But today, a faint tension prickled the back of his neck, urging him to move faster. Jake's mind wandered as he walked, replaying the events of the week. It had been a tough few days. A broken fence near the southern edge of the property had let some of the cattle wander off, and he'd spent hours rounding them up. He could still feel the dull ache in his legs from riding the rough trails. As he approached the clearing, the breeze picked up, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that made his nose wrinkle. Jake stopped in his tracks, tilting his head. It wasn't the usual smell of damp earth or pine sap. It was something else, something unsettling. He scanned the horizon, his gaze narrowing as he noticed small tufts of fur caught on a nearby bush. His chest tightened. It wasn't unusual to see signs of wildlife out here, but this was fresh. Too fresh. He crouched down and touched the fur with his fingertips. It was coarse and dark, likely from a wolf. The unease in Jake's stomach turned into something sharper. He straightened, his eyes flicking toward the forest. A low growl echoed faintly from the distance, almost drowned out by the rustling of leaves. Jake's heart skipped a beat. End of section 8. He wasn't the type to panic easily. Years of living in these parts had taught him how to handle all kinds of situations, from wild animals to sudden storms. But this felt different. The growl was close, closer than he liked. Instinctively, Jake tightened his grip on the walking stick he carried. It wasn't much, but it would do in a pinch. His eyes scanned the tree line, searching for movement. The woods were dense here, the thick underbrush and towering trees casting long, dark shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. "All right," he murmured under his breath, his voice steady but low. "What's out there?" The growl came again, louder this time. Jake felt his pulse quicken. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt. A sudden cry split the air, high-pitched and desperate, freezing him in place. Jake's head snapped toward the sound. It wasn't a wolf, but something else. Something in trouble. He moved quickly, brushing past low branches and stepping over tangled roots as the cry came again, each time more frantic. The forest seemed to grow quieter with every step he took, as if the world itself was holding its breath. When Jake finally broke through the last of the trees and into the clearing, his breath caught in his throat. There, just beyond the edge of the forest, stood a young Mustang horse. Its chestnut coat gleamed faintly in the morning light, but its body was tense, trembling with fear. Surrounding it, eyes glowing and teeth bared, was a pack of wolves. Jake tightened his grip on the stick and stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Not today," he muttered, his determination outweighing the fear pounding in his chest. Jake froze mid-step. The clearing was eerily still, but the tension in the air was undeniable. His eyes locked on the small Mustang horse standing in the center of the clearing. The young horse, barely older than a few months, stood trembling, its ears flicking back and forth in panic. Its chestnut coat shimmered faintly in the soft morning light, but Jake could see the rise and fall of its chest. Rapid, uneven, terrified. Then he saw them. Eyes glinted from the shadows, sharp, glowing, and predatory. Wolves. Jake counted at least 5 of them, their bodies low to the ground as they crept closer to the Mustang. Their movements were calculated, their growls low and guttural, vibrating through the still air. Jake's grip on his walking stick tightened. His pulse quickened as he assessed the situation. The horse had no chance, not like this. It was young, alone, and cornered. Every instinct in Jake's body told him to act, but he knew rushing in without thinking would only make things worse, for both him and the Mustang. The lead wolf stepped forward, baring its teeth. The others followed suit, circling the trembling horse. The young Mustang reared slightly, letting out a desperate whinny that echoed through the clearing. Jake's heart twisted at the sound. It was pure fear, a plea for help that no one else seemed to hear. Jake crouched low, keeping himself hidden behind a thick bush. His mind raced, weighing his options. He could shout, try to scare the wolves off, but there was no guarantee they'd leave, and if they didn't, the consequences could be deadly, for him and the horse. His eyes darted around the clearing, looking for anything he could use to turn the odds in his favor. A fallen branch? Rocks? Anything to make him appear bigger, more threatening. His breathing was shallow, his muscles tense as he tried to stay calm. The Mustang made a sudden move, a desperate attempt to break free. It bolted toward the edge of the clearing, but the wolves were faster. They closed the gap within seconds, snapping at its heels and forcing it back into the center. Jake felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. This wasn't just nature taking its course. This was cruelty. "Come on, Jake," he muttered under his breath. "Think." The lead wolf growled louder, its hackles raised. It lunged forward, snapping its jaws just inches from the Mustang's trembling legs. The young horse let out another panicked cry, its hooves scraping against the hard ground as it tried to back away. Jake couldn't watch anymore. Taking a deep breath, he stood up from his hiding spot, stepping into the clearing. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the growls and cries. The wolves froze, their heads snapping toward him in unison. Jake took another step forward, raising his stick high above his head. "Get out of here," he yelled, his voice firm and unyielding. The pack hesitated, their growls softening as they assessed this new threat. Jake took advantage of the pause, waving his stick and shouting again, "Go on, get!" The lead wolf took a step back, its ears flattening against its head. The others followed suit, their bodies retreating slightly, but Jake knew better than to let his guard down. Wolves were smart. They were waiting to see if he'd back off first. Jake's eyes never left the pack as he inched closer to the Mustang. The young horse stood frozen, its sides heaving with every ragged breath. "Easy now," Jake said softly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "I'm not going to hurt you." The wolves growled again, their bodies shifting as if preparing to charge. Jake stomped his boot against the ground, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "I said, get!" This time, the pack broke. The lead wolf let out a sharp bark before turning tail, disappearing into the trees. The others followed, their growls fading into the distance. Jake stayed where he was, his stick still raised, until he was certain they were gone. Only then did he turn his attention to the Mustang. The young horse flinched as he took a cautious step forward, its wide, dark eyes watching his every move. "It's okay," Jake murmured, lowering his stick. "You're safe now." The Mustang didn't move. Its legs trembled beneath its weight, and Jake could see scratches along its side, likely from branches or the wolf's claws. His chest tightened at the sight. "You've been through it, huh?" he said gently. Jake crouched low, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He extended a hand, palm up, letting the horse see he meant no harm. The Mustang sniffed the air, its ears flicking nervously. For a moment, Jake thought it might bolt. But then, as if recognizing the lack of threat, the young horse took a hesitant step forward. Its nose brushed against Jake's hand, and a small, shaky whimper escaped its throat. Jake smiled faintly, his voice soft. "That's it. You're all right now." He glanced around the clearing, his mind already turning to what came next. The Mustang was safe for now, but it wouldn't survive long in its current state. Not alone. Jake knew he couldn't just leave it here, not after what it had been through. With a deep breath, he stood up and looked the horse in the eye. "Let's get you out of here," he said firmly, his tone filled with quiet determination. This was just the beginning. Jake took a deep breath, gripping the walking stick tightly in his hands. His mind raced as he stared at the young Mustang, trembling and scared, its wide eyes darting toward the shadows where the wolves had retreated. The pack was gone for now. But Jake knew they might come back, and when they did, the horse wouldn't stand a chance. He scanned the clearing quickly. He needed to act fast. The horse wasn't injured badly, but its thin frame and unsteady legs told Jake it had been through hell. It wouldn't survive much longer without food, water, and protection. "All right, kid," he said softly, his voice steady but firm. "We've got to move." Jake took a slow step forward, his boots crunching softly against the dry grass. The Mustang flinched, its legs trembling as it took a hesitant step back. Jake froze, lowering himself slightly to appear less threatening. "Hey, easy now," he said, his tone low and soothing. "I'm not here to hurt you. I promise." The horse's ears flicked, catching the calm in his voice. It didn't move closer, but it didn't bolt either. Jake considered this a small victory. He crouched down, setting the stick on the ground beside him. Slowly, he reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small piece of dried apple, something he always carried for long hikes. Holding it out in his palm, he stayed as still as possible. "Come on," he whispered, coaxing the Mustang gently. "Just a little closer." The young horse sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring. It took a hesitant step forward, then another, its gaze locked on Jake's outstretched hand. Finally, it stretched its neck, its soft muzzle brushing against Jake's palm as it took the apple. There you go," Jake murmured, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" The horse chewed slowly, its eyes still wary but no longer as panicked. Jake let it finish before carefully reaching out and touching the side of its neck. The Mustang flinched, but didn't pull away. Its coat was warm and soft, but he could feel the sharp ridges of its ribs beneath his fingers. "You're skin and bones, aren't you?" he said quietly. His chest tightened at the thought. How long had it been since this horse had eaten a proper meal? Jake glanced around the clearing again, his mind working quickly. His truck was parked about a mile away, but getting the Mustang there would be tricky. It was scared, exhausted, and likely wouldn't trust him enough to follow on its own. He needed a plan. "Okay," he muttered to himself. standing slowly. "Let's see if we can figure this out." He rummaged through his pack and pulled out a length of rope. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. Jake tied a loose loop at one end and approached the horse cautiously. "Easy," he said, his tone soft and steady. "This is just to keep you safe, all right?" The Mustang's ears flicked nervously, but it didn't move as Jake slipped the rope around its neck. He made sure it wasn't too tight, giving the horse enough room to move comfortably. "There we go," he said, stepping back to give it space. "Not so bad, right?" The horse shifted uneasily, tugging slightly at the rope, but Jake held firm. He kept his movements slow, guiding the horse a few steps forward. It resisted at first, its hooves digging into the ground, but Jake didn't give up. "Come on, kid," he urged, his voice calm but persistent. "We've got to get you out of here." Bit by bit, the Mustang started to follow. It wasn't smooth. Every few steps it would stop and try to pull away, its fear bubbling back to the surface. But Jake stayed patient, using soft words and gentle tugs to keep it moving. By the time they reached the edge of the clearing, Jake's legs were burning from the effort. The Mustang had grown more cooperative, but he could feel its exhaustion in every shaky step it took. He glanced at the sun, now higher in the sky, and knew they needed to pick up the pace. The path back to the truck was rough, winding through uneven terrain and thick underbrush. Jake kept a firm grip on the rope, glancing back every few seconds to check on the horse. "You're doing great," he said, even though his own breath was coming in short gasps. "Just a little farther." The Mustang let out a soft whimper, its ears flicking toward the sound of distant rustling. Jake froze, his heart pounding. The wolves were still out there. He tightened his grip on the rope and glanced around, his eyes scanning the trees for movement. "Not today," he muttered under his breath, quickening his pace. The rest of the walk was a blur of snapping twigs, rustling leaves, and the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Every step felt like a small victory, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. When they arrived at the station, he was still feeling alert. The station itself was pretty interior, with iron gray wooden boards and dark gray plastic. Finally, the truck came into view, parked under the shade of a large oak tree. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and turned to the Mustang. "What about the truck?" he demanded, watching the spectacular vehicle disappear in the bush. "Almost there," he said, guiding it toward the vehicle. The Mustang hesitated as they reached the tailgate, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the unfamiliar scent. Jake sighed, patting its neck gently. "I know it's scary," he said, "but trust me, you'll be safe here." He lowered the tailgate and spread out an old blanket he kept for emergencies. Then, with slow and steady movements, he guided the Mustang up and into the truck bed. The horse resisted at first, its hooves scraping against the metal, but Jake didn't give up. After what felt like an eternity, the Mustang finally settled onto the blanket, its body trembling with exhaustion. Jake closed the tailgate and leaned against it, wiping sweat from his brow. "Safe and sound," he said softly, glancing at the horse. "Let's get you home." As he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, Jake couldn't help but glance back at the Mustang through the rearview mirror. It was curled up on the blanket, its dark eyes watching him quietly. Jake smiled faintly and muttered, "You're tougher than you look, kid. We're gonna get through this." With that, he put the truck in gear and began the drive back to the ranch, the weight of the day's events pressing heavily on his mind and his heart. The truck rattled gently as it bumped along the dirt road leading to Jake's ranch. Every so often, he glanced in the rearview mirror at the young Mustang lying in the truck bed. Its chestnut coat was matted with dirt, and its sides rose and fell in shallow breaths. Jake could see the fear lingering in its dark eyes, but there was something else too, an exhaustion so deep it almost broke his heart. When they arrived at the ranch, Jake parked near the barn and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots. He approached the back of the truck carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. The Mustang flinched as he lowered the tailgate, its muscles tensing like it was ready to bolt. "Easy, kid," Jake murmured, his voice soft and steady. "You're safe now." The young horse's ears flicked toward the sound of his voice, but his body remained rigid. Jake crouched down, reaching out a hand to gently touch its side. The Mustang shuddered at the contact, but it didn't pull away. "That's it," Jake said, offering a small, encouraging smile. "Nobody's gonna hurt you here." He gave it a moment to settle before carefully guiding it down from the truck. The Mustang stumbled slightly as its hooves hit the ground, but Jake was there to steady it, his hands firm yet gentle. Once inside the barn, Jake spread a thick layer of fresh hay across the floor of an empty stall. The Mustang hesitated at the threshold, its eyes darting nervously around the space. "It's all right," Jake said, stepping inside first. He knelt down in the hay, patting the ground beside him. "See? Nothing to be scared of." The horse hesitated, its head lowering slightly as it took a tentative step forward. Then another. Finally, it stepped fully into the stall, its legs trembling as it settled onto the soft hay. Jake exhaled, relieved. "There you go," he said, sitting down cross-legged a few feet away. He didn't try to touch the Mustang again, letting it have the space it needed. Instead, he sat quietly, watching as its breathing began to slow and its body relaxed into the bedding. A few minutes passed in silence before Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out another small piece of dried apple. He held it out in his palm, waiting. The Mustang lifted its head, its nostrils flaring as it caught the scent. "Come on," Jake whispered. "You've earned this." The horse shifted slightly, its dark eyes locked on him. Slowly, it stretched its neck forward, its soft muzzle brushing against Jake's palm as it took the apple. Jake chuckled quietly, the sound low and warm. "You've got some fight in you, don't you?" he said, watching as the horse chewed. "That's good. You'll need it." As the hours passed, Jake stayed by the stall, speaking softly to the Mustang whenever it stirred. He brought in a bucket of water and set it down within reach, smiling when the horse took a few hesitant sips. "You're a tough little thing," he said, leaning against the stall door. "Most wouldn't have made it out of that clearing, let alone through the ride here. But you did." The Mustang glanced at him, its ears flicking forward at the sound of his voice. For the first time since he'd found it, Jake thought he saw a hint of trust in its eyes. That night, Jake returned to the barn with a blanket draped over one arm. The Mustang was lying down in the hay, its head resting on the soft bedding. It lifted its head slightly as Jake approached, but didn't seem as tense as before. "Figured you could use this," Jake said, carefully spreading the blanket over its back. The horse flinched at first, but then relaxed, its body sinking deeper into the hay. Jake sat down beside it, resting his elbows on his knees. "You've been through a lot," he said quietly, "but you're here now, and I'm going to make sure you're all right." The Mustang let out a soft whinny, its eyes fluttering shut as it rested its head back on the hay. Jake smiled faintly, reaching out to stroke its neck. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got you." For the first time in years, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. He stayed there until the barn grew dark, his hand resting gently on the Mustang's side as it drifted off to sleep. In that moment, the bond between them felt unshakable, like two survivors who had found solace in each other's presence. The first morning after bringing the Mustang home, Jake found himself standing by the barn door earlier than usual, steaming coffee in one hand and a bundle of hay in the other. Inside the stall, the young horse lay curled up on the soft bedding, its chest rising and falling in steady breaths. The tension that had gripped its body the night before seemed to have eased, but Jake could still see the fragility in its frame. Setting the hay down, he crouched by the stall door and spoke softly. "Morning, kid. Let's see if we can get you feeling a little better today." The Mustang opened its eyes, watching him cautiously. Jake moved slowly, laying out the hay in the corner and filling a small bucket with fresh water. The horse sniffed the air but didn't move, its body still too weak to do much more than lift its head. "It's all right," Jake said, stepping back to give it space. "Take your time." Over the next few days, Jake kept a close eye on the Mustang. He cleaned its wounds daily, using a damp cloth and gentle hands to wipe away dirt and debris. Each time the horse flinched, Jake paused, speaking in a calm, reassuring tone. "You're all right," he'd say, his voice low and steady. "I know it stings, but it'll help." The Mustang began to respond to his presence in small, subtle ways. It no longer flinched as much when Jake entered the stall, and its ears started to flick toward him whenever he spoke. By the third day, it was standing on shaky legs, its dark eyes following Jake as he moved around the barn. "There you go," Jake said with a small smile. "Told you were tougher than you looked." One afternoon, Jake decided it was time to take the next step. He opened the stall door wide and stepped back, giving the Mustang the freedom to explore the paddock just outside the barn. At first, the horse hesitated, its hooves barely crossing the threshold. "Come on," Jake coaxed, holding out a small piece of apple. "The sun's shining. It's a good day to stretch your legs." The Mustang took a tentative step forward, then another. As its hooves touched the grass, it paused, sniffing the ground as if rediscovering a long-forgotten sensation. Jake stayed nearby, watching as the horse took its first steps into the open air. "That's it," he said softly, "one step at a time." In the days that followed, the Mustang grew stronger. Its thin frame began to fill out as it ate more regularly, and its coat regained a healthy shine. Jake noticed a spark returning to its eyes, a sense of curiosity and life that hadn't been there before. The milestones came one by one. First, the Mustang started trotting around the paddock, its movements still cautious but more confident with each day. Then came the playful moments, like when it nudged a bucket over just to hear it clang, or pawed at the ground to uncover hidden patches of grass. Jake couldn't help but laugh the first time the Mustang nickered at him, its ears flicking forward as it approached him in the paddock. "Well, look at you," he said, rubbing its neck. "Starting to feel like yourself again, huh?" Their bond deepened with every passing day. The Mustang began to follow Jake around the paddock, its steps in sync with his as he repaired fences or checked on the other animals. It even started greeting him at the barn door each morning, its soft whinnies becoming a familiar and comforting sound. One crisp morning, Jake decided it was time to push the boundaries a little further. He opened the gate to the larger field beyond the paddock, giving the Mustang its first taste of real freedom. At first, the horse stayed close to him, its steps cautious as it surveyed the wide expanse of open land. But then, as if realizing the space was its own, it broke into a run. Its legs stretched out, its chestnut coat gleaming in the sunlight as it galloped across the field. Jake leaned against the fence, a proud smile on his face. "That's what you were born for," he said quietly, watching as the horse kicked up its heels and bucked playfully. The weeks turned into a rhythm, feeding, grooming, and spending time in the open fields. Jake noticed the Mustang's personality shining through more and more. It was bold but careful, playful but alert. Every interaction felt like a small victory, a testament to how far they'd both come since that first night in the clearing. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Jake stood by the fence, watching the Mustang graze. He thought back to the night he'd found it, trembling and surrounded by wolves, and felt a swell of pride. The fragile, frightened animal from that night was long gone, replaced by a strong, confident creature that seemed to own every inch of the field it stood in. The Mustang trotted over to him, its dark eyes soft as it nuzzled his hand. Jake chuckled, rubbing its neck. "You've come a long way, kid," he said. "Didn't think you'd make it, but here you are." As the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Jake leaned against the fence, the Mustang standing beside him. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. They'd both found something that day, a chance to heal, a reason to keep going. And Jake knew that, no matter what came next, they'd face it together. The morning was crisp, the kind that promised the start of something new. The Mustang stood by the paddock gate, its coat gleaming in the soft golden light. It had been weeks since Jake found the young horse in the clearing, trembling and surrounded by danger. Now the transformation was undeniable. Strength radiated from its every step, and a quiet confidence had replaced the fear in its dark eyes. Jake leaned against the gate, arms crossed, watching the Mustang as it grazed on the last patches of morning dew. There was a bitter-sweet feeling in his chest, one he couldn't shake. He knew this moment would come. He'd always known. The Mustang didn't belong here, penned in by fences and walls. It belonged out there, running free across the open plains. He let out a slow breath and tapped the gate lightly with his knuckles. "All right, kid," he said, his voice steady though his heart felt heavy. "Time to see what you're made of." The Mustang lifted its head, its ears flicking toward Jake. It trotted over to him, nuzzling his hand as if it understood what was about to happen. Jake smiled faintly, running his fingers along its neck. "You've got a whole world waiting for you out there," he said softly. "But don't go forgetting the guy who got you this far, all right?" He opened the gate slowly, the sound of the latch echoing in the quiet morning air. The Mustang hesitated for a moment, glancing between Jake and the open field beyond the paddock. Jake stepped aside, giving it the space it needed. The horse took a tentative step forward, then another. Its movements were cautious at first, its head turning back to Jake as if seeking reassurance. Jake nodded, his smile growing. "Go on," he said. "It's all yours." With a sudden burst of energy, the Mustang broke into a gallop, its legs stretching out as it crossed the open field. The sight took Jake's breath away. The young horse, once so fragile and afraid, now moved with a grace and power that seemed almost unreal. Its mane and tail streamed behind it like ribbons in the wind, and for a moment, Jake could swear he saw pure joy in its every step. The Mustang reached the far edge of the field where the land met the forest. It paused there, its chest rising and falling as it turned to look back. Jake raised a hand, tipping the brim of his hat. "Run free, kid," he murmured, the words carried on the breeze. Mustang let out a loud whinny, a sound that echoed through the hills. Then, with a flick of its tail, it disappeared into the trees, its chestnut coat blending into the shadows. Jake stayed by the gate for a long time, his eyes fixed on the spot where the horse had vanished. The field felt emptier without it, but there was peace in knowing it was where it belonged. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. The barn was quiet now, its doors slightly ajar, letting in the cool evening breeze. He thought back to that first night in the clearing, when he'd seen the Mustang surrounded by wolves. At the time, he'd thought he was saving the horse. But as he sat there, staring out at the endless stretch of land, he realized it had saved him too. A faint smile crossed his face as he tipped his cup toward the horizon. "Here's to second chances," he said quietly. Somewhere beyond the trees, the Mustang was running free, a testament to the power of resilience, hope, and the quiet strength it takes to let go. And that was enough for Jake. It was more than enough. If this story touched your heart, don't let it stop here. The journey of this Mustang is a powerful reminder of resilience, hope, and the difference a little kindness can make. There are countless animals out there facing challenges just like this one, waiting for someone to step in and give them a second chance at life. By liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel, you're not just supporting these stories. You're joining a community that believes in compassion and the power of small acts to create big changes. Together, we can raise awareness for wild Mustangs and other animals in need, ensuring their stories inspire more people to care and take action. Every share helps spread this message of hope. Every like strengthens the movement. Every subscription builds a platform for these voices to be heard. Let's make a difference, one story, one Mustang, one moment of kindness at a time. Click the subscribe button, share this video with someone who loves animals, and join us in making the world a kinder place for every living being. Together, we can change lives.